Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight, we'll trace the entire story of the Great Depression. Banks shut their doors, and people's savings were suddenly gone. Paychecks stopped coming. Some families lost their homes. And all over the country, people found themselves standing in lines for work and for help. We'll take our time and keep an easy pace. We'll stay close to the people who lived through it and to the quiet ways this era still shapes American life today. Before we begin, if you find comfort in calm retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, you're welcome to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, settle back, and let the rest of the day drift while we ease into tonight's story. In the years before the Great Depression, the United States moved with quick confidence through the Coolidge years. Output rose, radios played in kitchens, and new refrigerators hummed beside ice boxes that had been pushed aside. Electric lines reached more homes and shops, and streets at night glowed with glass letters that promised comfort and speed. Assembly work found a new rhythm, and companies trimmed motions to save time and raise the count of finished parts. A car in the driveway gave reach across county lines, and a Sunday drive became part of an ordinary week. Credit pulled households forward. Installment plans turned desire into schedules that fit a paycheck, and stores promised ownership after a string of small payments. Automakers pushed the model year and offered credit through their own finance arms, which taught buyers that a car could be renewed on time. Appliance makers followed the pattern, and radios moved from store shelves into crowded tenements and small farmhouses. Advertising sharpened its voice and learned to speak about self-respect, comfort, and the new signs of a modern home. Chain stores expanded along rail lines and highways, and catalogs reached places where Main Street was a drive away. Beneath the bright retail world, farm life sat under quiet pressure that had grown since the wartime boom faded. During the war, high prices and patriotic demand had pulled acres into heavy use, and many farmers took on debt to add tractors and land. After the armistice, prices fell, bills did not, and harvests met buyers who could pay less. Soil tired under repeated planting, and wind-carved patches in dry seasons across the plains. Small banks in farm towns felt the strain as loans went bad and as depositors watched neighbors lose fields to auctions. This was a warning. Banks often stood alone within a state, with one office and a narrow base, and this made each town more vulnerable. When a mill closed or a crop failed, loans defaulted and trust weakened, and the bank could not draw help from stronger partners nearby. Rules differed state to state, and examiners had uneven tools and staff. The country had no insurance for deposits, so a rumor could turn into a line at the teller window before lunch. In the mid-1920s, many rural banks closed, yet memory of those failures did not spread into city finance. The gap mattered. Speculation did not begin with stocks, since a real estate fever ran hot in Florida earlier in the decade. Lots were platted in mangrove and sand, and promoters sold dreams of bungalows and golf by the sea. Rail capacity strained under the volume of building material, and storms and delays broke the mood. Prices fell, buyers vanished, and the bus left empty streets and half-finished shells. This early cycle taught a lesson about leverage and hope, yet the lesson stayed local and soon faded from broad talk. Stocks would draw the next crowd. Credit made that crowd larger. Daily, the stock market turned into a stage for optimism, and brokers matched buyers with loans that used shares as collateral. Call money could be raised quickly when demand ran high, and banks and trust companies supplied funds to brokers. Prices rose in steps and seemed to explain themselves as proof of a new economy that had solved the old cycle of fear. Investment trusts gathered pools of assets and sold shares to the public, and some trusts held other trusts in towers of claims. A pullback could turn those into traps. That risk was easy to ignore while gains arrived. Utility holding companies built layers of control above local providers and spread costs and returns over complex maps of debt and equity. In good times, the flow looked smooth, and bonds seemed safe for small savers and for banks that wanted steady income. In pressure, weakness at the bottom could climb upward and threaten the holding companies that had gathered pride and praise. A few leaders became symbols of the promise, and crowds looked to them as guides. When profits slowed, these structures left little room to adjust without cutting plans or raising new funds. The shine hid thin margins. Monetary policy was young and careful, and the central bank learned by experiment and debate. Leaders watched gold flows and the exchange value of the dollar, since the gold standard was still the anchor for policy. When Europe showed strain, officials tried to ease money to help partners hold their pegs and to steady trade. When markets at home ran hot, they tried to tighten, and the signals could arrive late or unevenly. The mix left credit easy for stretches, then more costly, and the timing fed belief that the rise could go on. Policy would matter once fear held. Earnings at the top rose quickly, while many wages rose more slowly or shifted with hours, and unions were often on the back foot. Productivity improved, yet the share going to profits outpaced pay in many sectors, which held down broad buying power. Farm incomes lagged, and farm costs often felt fixed by debt and by distance to market. Urban renters paid a growing share of income to landlords, and new buildings slowed after the middle of the decade. Household budgets tightened when hours fell, and a radio on time could be comfort and strain. Fragility was visible to many. Managers studied motion and time and wrote handbooks that promised order and predictability, and the mood spread beyond the shop floor. Trade journals and newspapers printed tidy lines on charts, and editors wrote that the cycle might be tamed by knowledge and scale. Executives spoke about a new era of stability, and speakers at banquets told stories about science in business. Investors took comfort from the tone and from rising dividends, and they placed orders for more shares. It was easy to believe that skill and data had made the economy safer and gentler. That belief would be tested soon. Policy at the top favored low taxes, budget surpluses, and quiet oversight, and leaders voiced trust in the wisdom of markets. Commissions met, reports were filed, and the public line was calm restraint rather than intervention. Antitrust action slowed, and mergers drew bankers and lawyers into long projects that knit industries together. Regulators of markets watched for fraud, yet they did not seek to set guards on lending for shares. Many voters liked the tone and pace, and they linked prosperity with restraint. That link would loosen when stress grew. For now, mostly. Across the ocean, debts and reparations tied the economies together in a loop that demanded steady lending from New York. Germany owed allies. Allies owed the United States. And the flow of funds passed through bonds sold to American buyers. Plans were written to manage payments. And for a while, the system worked as long as loans kept moving. If lending slowed, pressure rose in Europe, and central banks tried to defend currencies by raising rates and holding gold. These steps pulled on money markets and shaped conditions for brokers and banks at home. The chain held until it broke. Beneath the high spirits, some gauges had begun to soften, and patient observers could see the change. Home building slowed after the middle of the decade as cities stretched outward and lots went unbuilt. Office space rose faster than many tenants, and warehouses held more goods as buyers paused. Railroads moved heavy freight at a slower pace, and steel orders shifted with caution. Automakers cut prices to keep factories busy, and dealers took more used cars in trade. Yet the headline index of shares climbed and pulled attention away from the softer signs. The mood favored steady speed over caution. Under the surface, the social net was thin, and most workers had no formal protection against job loss. If hours fell, families turned to savings, to relatives, or to the church basement, where volunteers brewed coffee and set out bread. City halls offered small relief funds, and private committees tried to stretch gifts across neighborhoods. Hospitals carried unpaid bills as routine, and school boards waived lunch fees when they could. Banks held deposits without a federal backstop, and a failure could erase years of careful saving. The system worked while broad belief held. That belief would face a hard test. Culture sold optimism through stories, songs, and pictures, and living rooms gathered around radios for shows and news. Movie palaces drew crowds with sound, and stars on screen hinted that style and luck could lift anyone. Ballparks and boxing rings filled summer nights, and headlines followed feats that felt larger than an ordinary life. Music traveled through records and radio relays, and dances crossed city and town lines. People felt modern, and that feeling made risk seem manageable. The Great Depression was not a picture anyone held in mind during these evenings. Quiet signals found little room beside the glow. As the summer of 1929 faded, talk about gains still filled brokerage rooms, and the Great Depression was not yet a phrase in print. Factory orders softened in a few lines, and some managers trimmed overtime and watched inventories with care. Bankers discussed call rates and the flow of funds to brokers, and some raised quiet doubts. New bond issues still came to market, though a few met slower demand. Retail sales held up in many cities, and school opened on time with new shoes and lunch pails. The turning point sat just ahead. The mood still leaned toward hope. The map of the late 20s held strengths that people loved and weaknesses they could not see. And that mix would shape the Great Depression that followed. Credit had stretched across households, banks were thin in places, and markets were linked by habit and belief. Prices on the tape looked like a guide, yet they were only the latest print of a mood that could turn. Rural distress pressed against town life, and the farm crisis waited for a spark. Cities glowed, charts pleased editors, and the slump stayed quiet behind glass. Within months, strain would become the common story. In the months before the Great Depression, signals flickered through markets and offices while most people carried on. Brokers scrambled along the curb, the ticker lagged the trades, and margin accounts grew fat on easy credit. Radios brought nightly summaries that sounded like victory parades. Families set aside doubts and sent savings to new accounts at branch offices. Investment clubs met in church basements and pledged discipline. Warnings appeared, then vanished under headlines about records. Confidence hardened into habit, and habit steered the weak forward. Cool money fed the rise by turning stock into collateral and collateral into fresh loans. Rates jumped at noon and settled by the close. Yet the machine never seemed to stall. Banks with spare funds joined trust companies and corporations that wanted quick interest. The loop drew cash from small towns into Wall Street through correspondent ties. Most depositors never knew the path. They trusted a teller and a marble counter. The line held day after day, which taught people that it would always hold. Investment trusts multiplied and offered a neat story about safety through numbers. A trust held dozens of names, and some trusts even held other trusts. Stacks of claims rose like scaffolds. While prices climbed, the design pleased buyers who wanted comfort with their gains. Prospectuses listed famous companies and promised care. Dividends were quoted like hymns. The substance, though, grew thinner with each added layer. A small slip at the base could climb the stack and shake the top, which few wanted to believe then. Utility holding companies stitched wires, stations, and dams into pyramids that spanned states. Bonds lay under preferred shares and common shares, and fees flowed upward through each tier. In good months, the whole looked steady. In pressure, a sag in one district could ripple through the chart. Small investors bought the bonds for safety and liked the regular coupons. Accountants admired the order. Complexity won praise until power bills slowed. Then the cushions turned out to be narrow, and confidence thinned without warning for months. Pool operators promised order and described themselves as guardians of calm prices. In practice, they staged shows that drew crowds to favored names. Tips moved across lunch counters and barber chairs. Newspapers covered the stars of the floor as if they were athletes. People liked the idea that someone strong would stop a slide. It felt like insurance without a premium. The habit worked while shares rose. When trouble came, the helpers were busy elsewhere or had sold, and protection turned out to be missed. Small investors opened margin accounts with little cash down and large hopes. Selling seemed simple at a kitchen table where time felt wide. It was harder at noon in a crowded phone booth when prices jumped 2 lines between rings. Clerks promised discipline and reminded clients to add funds during dips. Many did. The habit of buying on weakness turned into a trap on days when weakness did not stop. A rule that worked for months failed all at once. Lessons arrived late and hard. Economists split over what the numbers meant. Some pointed to price-earnings ratios that far outpaced profits. Others said technology and scale made old yardsticks useless. A famous professor announced a high plateau, and papers printed the phrase "with care." A veteran forecaster warned of a sharp break, and few wished to hear him. People held recent statements that showed gains and waved them like proof. The debate felt civilized while prices rose. It would feel different in the weeks to come for many listeners. At the central bank, officials tried to cool speculation without crushing trade. They raised the discount rate, urged restraint through letters, and shifted open market purchases. The plan relied on banks to curb loans that fed market accounts while still funding factories and stores. The separation was hard to draw in practice. Money found side doors and new pipes. Traders decided the rise would outlast the pushback. Rates stung for a day and then faded. The climb resumed and made policy look weak to many. International ties added tension that few Main Street investors followed. American loans helped Europe manage debts and reparations. When lending slowed, pressure rose abroad and interest rates moved in response. Gold shipments shifted with each move. Central banks defended currencies and then loosened to aid trade. Those swings affected cool money in New York and shaped the supply of funds for brokers. The web made distance feel near. A tremor overseas could reach the tape within days and change the tone for Wall Street nerves. The culture of tips turned market talk into a neighborhood sport. Clerks swapped names at lunch and said a pool would stand behind them. A barber whispered that her favorite stock could not drop because men of means were in charge. Newspapers profiled operators as if they were champions. The belief that someone larger would catch a fall shaped many trades. It worked until those figures ran out of cash or courage. Then the fall met no hands on crowded, ordinary, heartbreaking autumn days here. Small town banks sent balances to city correspondents in search of a better return. City banks placed that money in call loans to brokers. The link was not obvious to people who kept passbooks at home. A farmer believed his dollars slept nearby, yet they traveled to the curb and back. If prices dropped, the pull on those balances would sweep across states. The system worked while trust held. Without insurance, a rumor could turn into a line before lunch in the county seat lobby. By late summer, some gauges softened. Building slowed, steel orders eased, and rail cars showed more space between loads. Automakers trimmed shifts and pushed discounts. These signals appeared in trade pages that few read closely. The front page carried new highs and stories about American genius. Ordinary life followed the louder signal. Paychecks met bills. Sunday drives filled the roads. The sense of distance between charts and chores kept people calm. The gap would matter soon, and few saw it growing in those warm weeks. Seasoned traders began to hold more cash and wrote notes about prices they would honor only after a real break. They did not share those notes widely. They spoke like bulls to keep clients steady. A few banks trimmed exposure to brokers and chose safer paper. The change was real, but not large enough to slow the tide. Most branches still opened accounts for new buyers each morning. The line at the window taught its own lesson about crowds, speed, and misplaced faith on long afternoons. The culture treated leverage as a tool for the confident. A small stake could control a large position. It seemed efficient to those who measured results by weeks. Trouble appeared when prices paused and lenders asked for more margin. A call forced a sale, which pushed prices lower and triggered the next call. The chain reaction was described in books. In practice, it felt like weather that would not change. People met it with hope rather than plans during loud, restless, late market sessions everywhere. In Washington, the argument grew over how far policy should reach. Some urged stronger steps against loans that fed speculation. Others feared overreach more than excess. Hearings produced concern, yet little action. Agencies lacked clear tools to shape a market that moved this quickly. The stance felt like modesty and restraint. The Great Depression would teach a different view of that choice. At the time, many voters still linked prosperity with a light touch and preferred speeches to rules in the crowded autumn rooms everywhere. Advertisements for chart schools filled business pages and promised safety through simple rules. Buy rising names and sell after small drops. The rule worked until everyone tried to use the same exit. Orders piled at one price and then at the next. Movement turned into rush. A few columnists used the plain phrase, the slump, when they imagined a turn, and readers laughed. Doubt sounded like poor manners. Confidence stood taller than caution and waved the crowd through on bright, late, unseasonably warm afternoons downtown. Across the country, small papers praised leading financiers and manufacturers and spoke gently about responsibility. Trade groups proposed voluntary codes for fair practice. The idea sounded tidy and humane. It did not restrain the appetite for risk. Households cared most about jobs, pay, and the rising tape that printed hope. Their view framed danger as distant. The Great Depression was not a phrase many spoke aloud. Ordinary routines held the stage, and the season felt safe enough for a country proud of progress and growth. In the last weeks before October, broker loans reached fresh records. The pile made every slip feel larger than the screen showed. A small drop forced sales that fed the next drop. Support money was already tied up in other names. Operators could not stand everywhere at once. The tape sped up when help did not arrive. This mechanism was old, yet many had not lived through it. They were about to learn what the chain could do in crowded rooms across the country together. Mid-October blended routine with plans for holidays. Stores stacked toys and ribbons. Teams played before cold winds. Farms brought in the last rows of corn. Boards scheduled winter budgets and ordered coal. These normal acts gave a sense of control. The conditions for a fast fall were in place anyway. The Great Depression did not look near from a porch or a streetcar seat. It waited inside habits that had grown comfortable and hard to quit for investors, bankers, and ordinary families that month. All these strands formed a bubble that looked reasonable from the inside. Hopes aligned with routine. New tools truly raised output and made life easier, which hid the risk of excess. Credit stitched every part to every other part. When one seam pulled, the fabric would move all at once. The story would soon turn. The Great Depression would enter public speech after a first hard fall. For now, people locked doors, turned off lamps, and trusted that morning would be kind for a while. Great Depression would soon become a common phrase, and October 1929 supplied the break that forced it into speech. The month opened with busy trading and a feeling that the cool air would clear nerves. Newspapers quoted chiefs who promised order. Factory reports were mixed, yet most desks read them as background noise. Margin accounts were heavy. The tape ran late by minutes and sometimes by more. Buyers still imagined a soft landing. What followed arrived in sharp steps that turned late confidence into fear within days. On a clear Thursday morning, orders piled high before the bell. News of slower sales and a few poor earnings had mixed with rumors of tight money. The first prints were lower and then fell again. Clerks put through stop orders and watched the slide deepen. The floor filled with runners who shouted for space. Phones in branch offices rang without pause. Managers urged clients to hold steady, then asked for more margin. The day would be remembered as the start, and it earned the name Black Thursday. In those first hours, a group of leading bankers met in a paneled room near the exchange. They formed a pool to show support and calm the tape. A tall broker crossed the floor and bid for a bellwether at a price meant to be seen. The move slowed the fall and cheered the galleries. By the close, the market had recovered much of the loss. Papers printed relief and praised courage. For a weekend, the mood held. Underneath, the accounts were strained and the loans were still heavy. Friday brought steadier prints. Support money returned, and pooled orders found targets to lift. The tape ran smoother, and crowds in brokerage rooms breathed again. A few took the chance to sell and lower their risk. Many others saw the rebound as proof that strong hands stood behind the market. Headlines said the worst had passed. Clerks sent out statements that did not look as bad as clients feared. Over the weekend, families talked about lessons and still hoped the new week would be kinder than the last. Monday took that hope and shook it. Selling began at the open and found no stable floor. Margin calls went out and came back unanswered. Orders to sell at market met thin bids and turned into gaps. The ticker lagged far behind, so that rooms full of small investors watched quotes for prices already gone. Brokers warned clients that positions would be closed. A drift became a rush. Black Monday did not have the drama of a single crash. It was a grinding fall that left offices hollow. Tuesday began under clouds and stayed dark. Reports from the opening bell told of bids that vanished between calls. Stop orders failed to execute because prices skipped their levels. Clerks raised their voices and still could not match the flood. The tape trailed by a wide margin. Investors learned of losses minutes after they had already deepened. In many towns, customers crowded branch lobbies and stared at the clock. Some begged to know whether they were wiped out. Black Tuesday became a symbol for a loss of control. In that rush, the structure of loans worked against stability. Brokers called clients for funds to meet margin. Clients tried to borrow against other assets and found lenders cautious. Banks that had placed money in call loans pulled back and asked for repayment. To meet the calls, brokers sold the most liquid names. Those sales pushed the index lower and triggered more calls. The loop reinforced itself, and no single pool could absorb the flow. The mechanism was old. The size and density of exposure were new. For people far from the curb, the crash looked like confusion more than pattern. A housewife listened to the radio and tried to grasp what a point meant. A machinist asked whether his savings at the bank were tied to the fall. A teacher held a small trust and called to ask about a dividend. Many were not speculators. They had bought shares in a utility or a trust for income and pride. The fall bruised that sense of safety. It also cut future spending plans at kitchen tables. Reporters filed stories about crowds on Wall Street. Yet the scene reached beyond a few blocks. In Cleveland and St. Louis and Los Angeles, offices filled with worried faces. Some men walked up and down the same stretch of floor for hours. Women held ledgers and asked quiet questions. Managers posted slips on a board that showed the gap between last night and the latest print. A clerk with a clear voice read prices to a room and paused when whispers turned into groans. It felt like a storm that would not pass. By evening, governors and mayors tried to calm public nerves. They urged citizens to remain prudent and to carry on. Presidents of exchanges promised order for the next day. Bankers sent out statements that praised the strength of the nation. Churches opened side doors for worry circles and prayer. Reporters spoke with steady tones on the radio. Parents put children to bed and then sat at tables to sort bills. The Great Depression was still not their phrase. They used crash and slump and hoped they were temporary. Wednesday came with a mix of bargain hunters and fear. Some saw prices that looked cheap and stepped in to buy. Others accepted loss and cleared the books. The floor still felt tense, and each rumor made the tape wobble. The flow of call money did not look secure. Banks carried large loan books that could not expand much more. International news remained uneasy. Traders waited for some authority to declare a halt. None arrived. The market found a level that was lower and shaky and wide with doubt. Through these days, the technical side of trading showed gaps that would be studied for years. Order routing could not keep pace with the surge. The ticker system fell behind and made investors act on stale quotes. Risk controls relied on phone calls and paper forms. Record keeping at some houses could not capture the torrent. Short selling drew attention and anger. Many blamed it for the fall and asked for strict limits. Others argued it only revealed what was already there. The dispute would continue into the winter. Evidence of real-world damage appeared quickly. A furniture dealer cancelled an order for stock because customers had stopped by only to look. An auto plant cut a shift and told workers to check a bulletin board for updates. A small bank decided to hold more cash, which meant one fewer loan for new equipment at a local mill. A store manager reduced orders for winter coats. Each move seemed prudent by itself. Together, they reduced income and made the next decision easier to cut. That feedback loop was quiet and strong. Farm regions felt the change in subtle ways. Grain dealers paid a little less and asked for quicker delivery. Banks in county seats checked old files for slow accounts. A tractor sale was postponed. A rail siding stood with empty cars where there should have been 2 full lines. The harvest was what it was, yet the cash behind it had shifted. Rural families who owned a few shares found those accounts thin. Thin accounts meant less money for tools or a new roof. The shock widened across fields and towns. Not every voice spoke gloom. Some executives said the shakeout would clear weak holders and reveal value. Newspapers ran hopeful editorials about thrift, patience, and the strength of industry. Families heard those lines and tried to believe them. Yet each new call for funds cut a bit more trust. Each letter that reduced a dividend or cancelled it pushed habits to change. People began to delay small plans. A winter coat could last another season. A porch repair could wait. The downward pull worked through quiet choices made in kitchens. Charities saw signs before budgets did. A mission downtown served more lunches in late October. A settlement house wrote to donors and asked for flour and coffee. Teachers noticed that a few children arrived without coins for milk. Civic leaders organized committees and promised to coordinate relief if needed. The words "if needed" hung in the air. In many homes, pride blocked early requests for help. Neighbors covered gaps with small gestures. The Great Depression had not yet taken jobs in vast numbers. It had taken confidence and a share of savings. In Washington, the official line balanced calm with respect for markets. Leaders urged patience and said the basic picture was sound. They met with business figures and agreed to maintain wages where possible. Bankers spoke about liquidity and promised cooperation. The Federal Reserve System watched reserves and weighed the cost of strong action. There was no single office with a clear mandate to halt a stock fall. The national government had not been built for that task. The gap between the scale of the slide and the tools at hand was plain. By early November, the wildest days had passed, yet the damage lingered in balance sheets and minds. Households who had stepped into the market late were hurt most. Wealth that had seemed solid turned out to be paper values. Banks that had funneled money to brokers reduced new loans. Companies cut plans for expansion. Cities that relied on sales taxes and fees saw revenue slide. The phrase Great Depression still felt too large. People reached for older words and hoped they would fit. Winter would test those words in daily life. The crash alone did not create the long slump to come. It revealed the weight of debt and the weakness of banks that stood alone in many states. It shook trust and made every cautious choice seem wise. Those choices gathered into a wave that moved through trade and work. The process would take time. It would spread beyond the curb and the newsstands and touch kitchens, fields, and mills. The Great Depression would be named and felt in the months ahead. The story was shifting from markets to lives. In weeks after the crash, committees studied what had failed and what might be built. Bankers spoke of reform and people watched pay and prices. The Great Depression was moving from a market event into shared fact. The next phase would test institutions and the patience of daily life. Great Depression moved from panic to a settled grind in 1930 and 1931. The crash had shaken faith. Then routine choices finished the damage. Factories cut overtime first, then shifts, then whole lines that felt essential. Orders dried, inventories swelled, and a quiet fear moved through offices. Managers waited for revival and sent careful letters about temporary conditions. By winter, The word temporary fell thin beside rent, payroll, and taxes. The federal line urged calm, thrift, and duty, and asked business to hold wages. Firms tried for months. Then the math closed around them and forced cuts. A few large projects, like the dam on the Colorado, kept payrolls steady. Thousands of smaller jobs vanished without speeches or ceremony across towns. Banks faced the new year with thin capital and worried depositors. In late 1930, a failure in Tennessee spread through a southern web. Rumors ran faster than trains and pulled lines to teller windows. The collapse of a big New York bank added a harsh lesson in December. People learned that good addresses could still fail and take savings with them. There was no backstop, only the hope that other banks would reopen doors. Great Depression showed itself as a chain that linked rumor, fear, and cash. Every broken link forced the next weak link to carry more weight. Farm life entered the downturn, with years of strain already in place. Wheat and cotton prices fell, then fell again as buyers stepped back. The Federal Farm Board bought stocks to steady markets and found limits fast. Warehouses filled, and the world price kept sliding past each effort. Cooperatives fought to hold members, yet cash needs pushed crops to auction. Foreclosure notices rose with each hard month and sharpened anger in counties. Neighbors began penny auctions to keep farms with families who worked them. Sheriffs faced packed yards and bids of a few cents to stall sales. Great Depression deepened as drought returned to the plains in 1930. Soil lifted into brown skies and cattle grazed dusty stubble near windmills. Families trimmed meals and patched clothes and hoped for kinder weather. The farm crisis cut into towns when orders for seed, fuel, and repairs fell. Main Street stores hung signs that said easy terms and then closed early. Urban unemployment climbed in waves that matched factory schedules and raw materials. 1 month still felt normal. Then a division shut and sent everyone home. Lines formed at employment offices that handed out short cards and longer waits. Breadlines grew near soup kitchens that stretched church budgets to a thread. City committees tried to coordinate relief without admitting that need had surpassed charity. Great Depression pressed local pride against hard numbers and frayed it slowly. Mayors asked banks to buy municipal notes and keep the lights on. Some banks agreed for months. Then they faced runs and turned inward. State houses debated bonds for relief and met voters who feared new taxes. Legislatures compromised on small sums and hoped private funds would return. At the border of policy and trade stood tariffs that had long been argued. In mid-1930, the new law raised duties and promised protection for industry. Partners abroad replied with their own increases and cut orders for American goods. Exports slowed, and the pressure on factories deepened in states that relied on trade. Farmers who shipped wheat or hogs overseas found fewer bids and thinner margins. The choice that looked like help soon felt like a door closing both ways. Monetary policy moved unevenly through this stretch and often arrived late. Officials eased at first, then worried about gold and tightened through open market sales. Banks hoarded reserves as fear grew, and the credit gear slipped and ground. By 1931, the crisis abroad made every choice costlier at home. A proud Vienna bank failed, and worry crossed borders like a fast tide. European governments defended their currencies and raised rates that strained commerce. Funds moved like birds startled from a field, and calm was hard to find. Britain left gold in September and forced hard questions in New York. Defending the dollar meant higher rates and less credit for ordinary business. Letting the dollar slip felt like a break with every old promise. Great Depression placed policy on a narrow ledge, and nerves showed everywhere. The choice favored defense, and the price was deeper contraction through winter. Deflation changed the math of every debt and each plan for repair. Prices fell and made old loans heavier in real terms for families and firms. $1 tomorrow bought more than $1 today. So people waited. Waiting lowered sales and pushed prices down again, which rewarded waiting. This loop read like a simple lesson and felt like a trap in life. Families sold a ring or a radio to cover rent and coal. Pawn shops held memories in drawers and watched the interest pile up. Landlords forgave a week, then two, then posted notices when taxes loomed. Utility crews worked out quiet payment plans to keep lights and heat. Schools shortened terms and delayed repairs to stretch thin budgets through spring. Teachers stayed late and organized free lunches with grocers and bakers. Home economists taught soups that filled plates with beans, barley, and greens. Movie houses offered dish nights and gave plates to keep seats filled. Baseball teams cut prices and booked barnstorm games on off days. Radio sponsors shifted from luxury goods to soap and cereal with coupons. Writers profiled men who sold apples and women who sewed for neighbors. Some stories had grit and grace, and some read like warning flares. Labor relations turned tense as hours fell and work rules tightened to save jobs. Unions tried to hold on where they still had contracts and votes. In many shops, members left quietly when dues felt heavy beside groceries. Wildcat actions rose anyway, then faded when strikes met empty order books. Employers formed councils to share hours and spread work, which helped for a while. Wage cuts arrived later and hit pride as much as budgets. Great Depression turned small choices into moral puzzles that people carried home. Owners and clerks tried to hold each other up without saying the shape of fear. Church halls welcomed meetings on credit, soup, and coal, then listened to grief. Relief groups mapped blocks and assigned captains to knock on doors. Some households refused help until a neighbor insisted and stayed for tea. Other households disappeared in the night and left keys under the mat. Colleges saw applicants turn down admission because work felt safer than debt. Libraries filled each afternoon with people warming hands and saving kerosene at home. Young couples delayed weddings and shared rooms with family to cut rent. Street vendors learned new corners and traded gossip about jobs and relief. Public health nurses tracked measles and hunger and asked stores for milk. Deaths of despair rose in some cities, then fell with stronger community ties. Reporters wrote about those patterns with care and without easy answers. Entertainment offered soft relief that kept people together without much cost. Vaudeville mixed jokes with clean songs, and ushers watched for troubled faces. Preachers spoke about patience and mutual duty and avoided harsh blame. Civic clubs raised small funds and catalogued tools that could be lent. Police chiefs walked the line between eviction orders and neighborhood peace. Judges granted delays when they could, and landlords searched for quick compromise. Some cities declared moratoriums on tax sales for a season to buy time. State lines mattered when banks failed because insurance did not exist. Unit banking meant no branch network could move cash to weak corners. States with many small banks saw more fear and more long closures. States with big chains sometimes held longer because money could be shifted. Great Depression taught people to count envelopes and to guard coins. Children learned prices by heart and watched parents trade stamps at the counter. Teenagers found day labor on farms and skipped school during harvest weeks. Older workers faced layoffs first when factories needed fewer skilled hands. Women filled more service roles and stretched cash with careful market routes. Borders became common again, and bedrooms turned into small economies. Public works moved forward in bits that depended on local funds and credit. Road crews poured concrete across counties and kept crews paid through thin months. New schools rose slowly where bonds passed after hard town meetings. Sewer lines and water towers went up and gave plumbers steady work. Architects waited for the next call and walked past idle lots downtown. City art projects began late, and musicians filled halls sponsored by relief drives. Hoover urged voluntary effort and partnership between government and civic groups. He endorsed loans to banks and railroads through new channels near the end of 1931. Those channels were private at first and tried to pool strength without stigma. Participation lagged when healthy banks feared open ties to weak neighbors. Loans arrived late and carried terms that meant prudence more than urgency. Year-end statements showed vanished profit and new losses on assets once praised. Investors read the figures and saw that dividends would not return soon. Families shifted savings to cash when they could and hid bills at home. Gold coins appeared in drawers again and stirred talk about old habits. Newspapers reported arrests for small thefts of coal from rail yards. Judges balanced mercy and order and tried to keep families together. Speakeasies survived repeal debates by offering music and a cheap plate. Temperance groups held firm and preached duty and patience to crowded halls. City newspapers shortened pages to save paper and lost ads from luxury brands. Editors kept space for relief notices and school lunches and meetings on work. Universities gathered economists who argued about causes and cures through long evenings. A few warned about falling demand and urged public spending to fill the gap. Others pressed for confidence and thrift and said the storm would pass. The argument did not settle because evidence shifted with each new report. Great Depression moved policy by inches in those years, not by leaps. By early 1932, families would look back at 1930 and 1931 as a slide that never stopped. They remembered bank doors that stayed shut and the quiet clocks inside. They remembered men with hats in hand and women with ledgers open. They remembered leaders calling for patience while cupboards asked for quicker help. Great Depression had settled in, and winter would teach its weight. In the spring and summer of 1932, As the Great Depression hardened into daily routine, breadlines lengthened and tent camps spread across vacant ground. Men lined up before dawn, shoulders tucked against wind or heat, holding tin cups and stale hope. Women stepped in later with children, watched by volunteers who gave each family a ladle and a kind word. Kitchens run by churches, unions, and shopkeepers served soup thickened with beans and barley. Some days there was coffee and a slice of bread. Other days there was only broth and a promise to come back tomorrow. A city could count need by the blocks of quiet feet outside a basement door. On the edges of rivers, rail yards, and dumps, shacks rose from crate wood and tar paper. People called them Hoovervilles, and the name held both blame and a sour sort of humor. Families laid down flattened cans as shingles and sealed seams with pitch. Beds were made from rope and burlap, hung over frames of scavenged lath. A stove door opened onto a fire pit, dug into the earth, ringed with brick and patience. A single bucket and a rain barrel stood in the corner like necessary furniture. Neighbors set rules for noise, water, and safety, and they tried to keep order even when order felt far away. Life inside a camp was shaped by craft and care. Carpenters built straight walls and jackleg chimneys. Seamstresses took apart old coats and re-sewed them into blankets and small coats for children. A barber hung a mirror on a nail and worked for pennies or for food. A teacher kept a small class under a canvas awning and sounded out lessons while freight trains passed. A woman ran a tiny store of thread, buttons, and tobacco from a crate. A man with a busted wrist tuned a battered guitar and played in the evening while the smoke drifted low. The Great Depression did not cut evenly, and color lines made the fall steeper for many. Black workers were often the first fired and the last rehired. Relief lines sometimes moved faster for white faces. In the South, sharecroppers faced eviction after a poor harvest and found few officials who would write their names first. In northern cities, landlords warned tenants not to make noise about rent because the building had a waiting list. Mutual aid groups in black neighborhoods collected nickels for coal and ran kitchens when city funds ran dry. Churches and women's clubs organized babysitting so mothers could seek day work without leaving children alone. In the Southwest, Mexican and Mexican-American families faced raids and coerced departures. Officials called them repatriations, though many of those sent across the border were citizens. Men who had laid track or picked beets were told to board trucks. Some left to join relatives in towns they barely knew. Others stayed and kept quiet to avoid notice, moving from camp to camp when police arrived. Hardship mixed with fear, and communities learned to whisper before they asked for help. The cost fell on children who lost schools and on fields that lost skilled hands. Men without steady work became riders of the rails. A boxcar offered speed across vast distances and little shelter. Rail police guarded yards and gave bruising lessons against trespass. A jump went well if a man could catch the ladder as the car rolled slow. A jump went badly if his boot slipped or the train jolted. Hospital wards treated cuts and crushed fingers, then released patients to lawns with the evening crowd. Small towns kept lists of men willing to chop wood for a meal and a place to sleep in a shed. Women stretched food with soups, stews, and fried cornmeal, and they fixed shoes with glue and cloth. They kept ledgers that tracked every coin and every bill due. Rent parties filled rooms with music and small plates and raised enough to stall the landlord. Teenagers took odd jobs, cared for siblings, and learned to read want ads that changed little from week to week. Some couples shared flats with cousins and friends and turned 2 rooms into a home for 8. Privacy shrank and tempers sometimes flared. Yet many houses learned gentleness as a habit. Public nurses came with scales and milk and left with notes for a follow-up visit. City budgets cracked first at the corners. Tax receipts fell as businesses closed and property values sagged. Departments cut hours for workers who kept streets lit and water running. Some cities paid part of wages in scrip redeemable at local stores. Grocers accepted it because their neighbors needed food and because refusing it felt like a final cut. Street repairs paused and parks lost gardeners. Libraries shortened hours but stayed open as warm rooms with books and light. As the Great Depression deepened, the federal government tried loans to banks and railroads through new bodies that practiced caution. Charity leaders wanted direct aid to families, while many officials still preferred private relief. Voluntary committees stretched every dollar and begged for more. City supervisors wondered how to count need without shaming people. Clerks learned to ask questions gently and to smile at boys who arrived with notes from mothers. Relief came as sacks of flour, tins of fish, and vouchers for shoes. The line between private duty and public duty moved week by week. Hunger and eviction stirred protest that looked different in each place. In the Bronx and in Chicago, neighbors crowded stairwells when a family faced removal. Furniture that reached the sidewalk returned upstairs on the shoulders of friends. Police tried to clear hallways and sometimes gave up. Elsewhere, the sheriff posted a padlock and nobody watched because they were busy guarding their own doors. Workers organized marches for jobs and for relief rules that felt arbitrary. Speakers urged patience on some corners and loud action on others. By spring of 1932, veterans of the Great War heard that bills to pay their service bonus early might come to a vote. Many had been idle for months and lived in rooms where rent went unpaid. They formed caravans and rode freight trains and jalopies toward Washington. Newspapers called them the Bonus Army, and the name gave them a sense of shared purpose. A leader named Walter Waters helped set rules and relayed instructions with a chain of captains. The city made space at Anacostia Flats across the river from the capital. Shacks rose from scavenged lumber and corrugated tin, while flags fluttered on poles lashed with wire. Inside the main camp, men established streets, sanitation teams, and a mess line that ran morning and night. Women and children lived in a separate area with watchful eyes and extra guards at the gate. Chaplains held services, and social workers kept lists for births and medical needs. Police assigned liaisons who walked the rows and helped enforce the rule against drink. A small newspaper printed daily notices and reminders to stay orderly. Sympathetic restaurants sent stew and day-old bread alongside postcards of encouragement. Visitors from nearby neighborhoods brought blankets and tobacco and listened to stories at dusk. While the House debated, the Great Depression weighed on each vote because every member had jobless neighbors at home. The bill passed there, then stalled in the Senate. Veterans marched to the Hill with bands and banners and stood quiet while clerks read the roll. After the defeat, many men said they would wait for work or for another vote. Others planned to stay through the summer because they had no better place to go. Washington residents divided between concern and sympathy, and tempers cooled or rose with the heat. Officials argued over whether the camps should be cleared before the city's winter preparations. Clashes began after an order to clear a small downtown building used by overflow marchers. A scuffle grew when police pushed a crowd back from the doorway. Bricks flew and a gun went off, and 2 veterans fell. The chief asked for federal help to restore order. Troops assembled under General Douglas MacArthur with tanks and cavalry and infantry. On Pennsylvania Avenue, soldiers advanced with mounted units and clouds of gas. Spectators ran and children cried while the line moved toward the bridge. By nightfall, the downtown camp was cleared, and flames rose from shacks. Across the river at Anacostia, more troops pushed through the larger settlement. Families fled with bundles as fire spread along rows of huts. Newsmen took photographs that showed veterans coughing and youths stumbling with wet cloths over their faces. A few officers protested the reach of the operation and urged restraint. The orders held and the flats emptied under bright fire and steady boots. The images traveled fast and changed the way many people judged both the marchers and the government. The Great Depression already strained belief in national leadership, and the sight of veterans dispersed by soldiers cut it deeper. Supporters said a city had to be kept safe, and that discipline saved lives. Critics said men who had served under arms should not be met with arms. The president's name slipped once more into bitter jokes, told in lines that stretched around corners. Many veterans left for home with no home waiting. They became symbols of the long winter, and the photos hung in barbershops and union halls. Parents explained the pictures to children who had learned new words like eviction and soup. Even with anger close to the surface, most relief work in 1932 ran on quiet care. Unemployed councils kept lists of families to visit. Teachers sent home notes when a child looked thin or cold. Grocers extended credit and knew which houses would repay as soon as they could. Farmers near cities brought truckloads of corn and cabbages for kitchens run by the local paper. Shy neighbors slipped coins under church office doors. People made rules for dignity, like clean cups and fair turns and no questions in line. By autumn, radios and nickel shows offered small respites. Then the day returned with bills and breadlines. The Great Depression felt fixed in place, and people braced for a different hand soon. Great Depression had reached a dark winter by early 1933, and the banking system stood near a stop. In cities and small towns, people carried envelopes of cash under coats. Banks limited withdrawals and posted hours that grew shorter each week. State governors called brief holidays to halt runs. Merchants paid wages in scrip when currency was scarce. The country waited to see if a new president could turn fear. The clock on the vault wall looked loud in the quiet lobby. On March 4th, the oath moved from one hand to another, while crowds filled the Capitol. A steady voice reached radios that had been silent for lack of light. It promised action and pledged to meet the crisis with broad power if Congress failed to act. Many listeners sat straighter and felt the room change. Hope did not refill tills. It did change the next morning's news. Governors who had waited for cover prepared to close banks to buy time. 2 days later, the order went nationwide. A bank holiday began on March the 6th and extended through the week. Guards took posts at doors that were quiet. Account books waited on desks for examiners who would sort strong banks from weak ones. Families stored coins in jars and counted bills on kitchen tables. Stores accepted scrip issued by city halls and big employers. Streetcars ran, though fewer fares clinked in the box beside the driver's knee. Behind the scenes, the new team worked through nights that felt short. The task was to draw a clear line between institutions that could open and those that needed repair. Auditors sent triage lists to the Treasury. The lists used simple marks that told who could reopen, who needed help, and who must be merged or closed. That clarity mattered more than speeches. People had seen too much drift. A firm process could teach confidence and give the week a clean end. On March 9th, Congress met and moved a banking bill in hours. Members studied summaries while clerks carried papers between chambers. The law gave the Treasury tools to check banks, manage troubled assets, and arrange support from the central bank. It also allowed currency to expand against better collateral, to meet demand when doors opened. A simple message went with the law. People heard that line and held it. 3 nights later, the new president spoke to the country by radio. The voice was calm and careful. It explained what the examiners had done and how cash would flow once more. It asked people to return money to the system when banks reopened. It said that fear itself had frozen trade and that simple trust could thaw it. Many listeners felt as if someone had finally turned on a light. They slept and waited for Monday with a steadier breath. On March 13th, the first set of approved banks opened in the larger cities. Lines formed before dawn. They were quiet lines. People placed dollars on counters and asked for deposit slips. Tellers counted slowly to show care. Managers greeted old customers by name and smiled for the first time in months. The strongest banks reopened first, then others followed across the week. Currency that had been hoarded at home returned in steady streams. The sight of the flow calmed nerves. Stock markets also reopened and moved upward on relief. The rise did not fix broken balance sheets. It did show that panic had paused. Businesses noted the change and weighed new orders with less dread. Railroads scheduled more cars to meet shipments that had been held back. The habit of waiting began to loosen in some quarters. There were still closed doors and hard stories in many towns, yet the week drew a clear breath between fear and work. Not every bank returned. Some institutions were merged into stronger neighbors. Others entered receivership and would pay depositors over time. In those places, families kept tallies and adjusted plans around delays. The government created new channels to move credit to sound banks so that commerce could resume. Supervisors pressed for cleaner books and more capital. The early lesson was plain. A map of thousands of tiny, isolated banks had left towns exposed. Coordination could act like a bridge when water rose. Next came measures that reached beyond banks toward relief and work. The Great Depression had crushed incomes and stripped pride from people who wanted jobs. A work corps for young men took shape in camps run with simple rules. Crews planted trees, built trails, fought fires. Pay packets went home to families who needed cash for food and rent. The sound of hammers and shovels brought life to places that had been too quiet. Relief funds also moved through a new agency that sent dollars to states and cities. Local leaders hired caseworkers to test fair rules and to treat each family with care. The aim was to replace long lines with visits that matched aid to need. School boards expanded hot lunches with federal flour and milk. The help was not lavish. It was steady enough to keep hunger from spreading into panic. Dignity grew where the process felt humane. The farm crisis needed its own line of attack. The Great Depression had driven crop prices so low that each load brought loss. A new law offered payments to farmers who reduced plantings for the next season. The hope was to lift prices by easing supply. County committees measured acres and checked contracts. Barn meetings explained the forms in plain speech. Not every farmer agreed with the plan. Most wanted a way to stop the spiral. The first checks kept families on their land. Power and flood control in the Tennessee Valley offered another path. Dams rose on broad rivers and turned falling water into light. Farmers gained cheap electricity for pumps and tools. Towns received new factories that needed steady power. Crews cleared brush, blasted rock, poured concrete, and learned trades. The work changed a region that had lived with hard soil and dark nights. The success did more than light bulbs. It proved that public works could bind relief with long growth. Industry faced a tangle of falling prices and wage cuts and failing firms. A recovery law invited industries to draft codes for hours, pay, and fair practice. The aim was to stop ruinous competition and to spread work. Stores hung blue emblems in windows and pledged to follow the rules. Inspectors checked compliance and mediators heard disputes. Not all codes worked, and some favored large players. Yet many workers saw hours improve and a floor under wages. The sense of drift eased in some shops. Homeowners needed time and better terms. A new corporation bought troubled mortgages from lenders and wrote longer loans with lower payments. Families who had packed dishes into crates unpacked them. Boxes slid back under beds. Children went to sleep without listening for the sheriff. The plan did not save every house. It saved many that stood on solid lots with parents who still held jobs. Stable streets made nearby stores stronger and kept lights in windows that had grown dark. The stock market and the sale of new securities needed clearer standards. A new law for offerings required honest figures and full facts. Bankers who moved shares for clients faced stricter duties. The aim was not to punish success. It was to make truth a habit again, so that savings could find useful work without fear. Pamphlets explained rights in simple words. Over time, the change gave investors a steadier map. Trust that rests on proof endures longer than a slogan. money policy shifted as well. The country stopped paying out gold to the public and later changed the official price to raise reserves. The move ended a habit that had limited room for healing. It allowed the central bank to supply more credit as trade revived. Prices that had fallen for years began to rise a little. Farmers noticed first in the bids at elevators. Shopkeepers saw it in the pace of sales. The fear of a cheaper tomorrow eased just enough to matter. The administration also valued public example. Leaders told agencies to hire by merit and to publish clear rules. A secretary with a hard record on graft pressed for clean contracts. Engineers kept logs that showed where every dollar went. People who had given up on government read those ledgers in local papers. They saw bridges, schools, roads, and clinics tied to names and sums. That evidence answered cynicism better than a speech. The work stood where anyone could walk and see it. None of this erased dispute. Business leaders warned that rules would choke risk. Union organizers said codes did not go far enough. Farmers argued over quotas at feed stores. Judges questioned parts of the program and prepared to hear cases. Newspapers ran long pages of letters from readers who told of jobs found and jobs lost. The debate made sense. The slump had touched every corner and every trade. A large answer would always feel uneven at first. Yet by the end of 1933, the mood was different from the year before. The Great Depression still sat heavy. But the sight of open banks and men in camp uniforms and dams in the valley gave shape to progress. A family could imagine a job next month. A city could plan to pave a road and put a crew on it. The winter felt less like a cliff and more like a hill to climb. There were missteps and hard lessons. One agency rushed projects and drew charges of waste. Another moved too slow and lost seasonable work. Some local officials played favorites. Others stood firm and wrote fair lists. The administration replaced weak managers and kept the larger frame in motion. A program that adjusted mortgages struggled in some cities with titles and records. It learned and improved. The measure of the year was not perfection. It was the shift from paralysis to motion across a vast landscape. The first new year after the holiday dawned with fewer bank runs and more hiring notices. The Great Depression had not ended. It had changed direction. People still scraped and counted, yet they did so with plans. The word emergency began to share space with the word program on front pages. Families listened for the next radio talk and watched crews sink forms along a river. In that patient work, the country found a path out of the worst valley. The careful climb would continue. During the middle years of the Great Depression, Washington turned relief into work and sketched a safety net that would outlast the emergency. Agencies that began as experiments took on clearer shapes, and the country learned new rhythms of hiring, checks, and casework. Shovels and ledgers moved in tandem, and crews found that a paycheck tied to useful tasks felt different from a meal ticket. Cities that had stumbled from one short appropriation to the next began to map seasons and crews on calendars again. The change did not erase need, yet it steadied hands and kept hope near the surface. The first wave of long projects relied on the Public Works Administration, which funded dams, bridges, schools, and hospitals through contracts with private firms. The pace was cautious and the paperwork thick, yet the results were solid and visible. Concrete cured by rivers while steel rose over avenues, and local papers printed photos with dates and names. Younger men joined camps that taught trail work, erosion control, and firefighting, then sent most of their pay home. Families felt those dollars on tables where jars had been close to empty. Winter demands called for speed, and the Civil Works Administration hired millions for short spells to mend roads, sweep parks, and repair schools. The effort taught lessons about scale and the limits of quick fixes. It kept households through the cold months, then closed as spring returned. People argued about whether it had been a stopgap or a model. The memory would feed a larger program that tried to blend urgency with craft. That larger program arrived as the Works Progress Administration, and it set men and women to work on streets, airports, levees, and public buildings. Crews paved miles that had been mud every April. Bricklayers rebuilt schools that had burned or sagged. Survey teams mapped streams and moved stones that had choked culverts. Payroll clerks learned to log hours for thousands without losing the thread. The scale was new, yet the aim was simple, which was to swap relief lines for pay lines. Artists, writers, musicians, and actors found places in the work as well. A muralist covered a high school wall with a history of the town that students could point to by year. A theatre troupe carried plays to crossroads where tickets had never been sold. Folklorists gathered songs and stories from fields and porches and made a record of everyday speech. Bands gave noon concerts in squares and eased the noon hour. Books for the blind were recorded by careful voices in quiet rooms. Not every town welcomed the projects at first. Some grumbled that men leaned on shovels. Others said the new payrolls undercut private firms. Inspectors measured output and posted lists to answer doubts. When a flood hit and a fresh levee held, the talk changed. When a road stayed dry and a bridge stood firm, shopkeepers blessed the crews who had worn heavy boots through summer heat. At the same time, a deeper idea moved from paper to law. The nation had lived with old care through churches, lodges, and local committees. The collapse showed how thin that patchwork could be when the work vanished in clusters. The Social Security Act set a new frame for old age, job loss, and aid to families with little. It was not rich, and it was not quick, yet it created a path towards steady help rather than a passing basket. Old age insurance promised monthly checks after a working life, funded by payroll contributions. Unemployment insurance promised a stream for a season when a job ended, with states managing the rules and the reserves. Aid to dependent children set money aside for households without a second paycheck. These strands built habits that will grow stronger with use. The first taxes began before the first regular checks, which made some critics scoff. The design looked slow until people saw what a claim could do. The law drew lines that reflected the time and its politics. Many farm workers and domestic workers were left outside the core insurance plans. That choice hit black families hardest in the South and in cities where service jobs were common. Organizers protested, and newspapers mapped the gap in charts that did not need words. Over years, some exclusions narrowed, yet the early design shaped money and health for a generation. A promise set on paper could not be equal without equal doors. Labor found a new footing as well. Great Depression recovery seemed fragile unless pay could rise and buyers could return to stores. The National Labor Relations Act confirmed a right to organize and to bargain, and it created a board to judge disputes. Many workers heard new language about elections, contracts, and unfair practice, and they used it within weeks. The idea was simple and strong, which was to balance the talk between floor and office. Unions that had aged into small crafts now faced a movement that wanted to gather whole plants. A new Congress of Industrial Unions set out to organize steel, autos, rubber, and packing. The words were plain and the tactics were inventive. Leaflets invited afternoon meetings by the river or in church gyms. Women helped keep lists and passed caps for dues, while men worked late shifts. Lawyers learned the rules of the new board and filed petitions with neat signatures. Conflict arrived, and lessons followed. The spring of 1934 saw pitched strikes on the docks of the Pacific Coast, in the streets of Minneapolis, and outside a parts plant in Ohio. Police and guards swung clubs, and crowds threw rocks and held lines with linked arms. Governors called mediators and sometimes the guard. Death appeared on a few hot afternoons, and funerals moved slowly past storefronts with blinds drawn. The shock taught both sides that the old playbook could end in ruin. Out of that pain, the sit-down strike emerged as a way to hold a plant without breaking machines or facing strikebreakers. Workers occupied lines, kept order, and allowed in food and mail. Nurses treated colds and cuts on packing tables turned to clinics. Women formed outside brigades to block attempts to clear the buildings. Ministers visited and carried messages. Judges weighed injunctions and stalled when they thought violence would follow. A winter in Flint ended in a pact that set pay and rules on paper. The new contracts brought dues, shop stewards, and grievance steps that could be walked one by one. They taught both parties to write careful sentences and to live by them through months that were tense and dull in equal share. A steward learned to collect facts before a meeting. A foreman learned to count warnings before a discharge. The habit of rules made factories feel less like fiefdoms and more like workplaces. There were still fights, yet there were also signatures that held. Women pressed for a share in the gains and for the simple right to steady work. Codes that had once limited hours for so-called protection now looked like limits on pay. Laundry workers organized for fair weights and sane schedules. Hotel maids formed locals that paid strike benefits and offered English classes at night. Housewives' leagues demanded lower prices and boycotted shops that cheated with false scales. The story of labor broadened beyond mills and yards into kitchens, corridors, and dime stores. The Fair Labor Standards Act drew a floor under wages in covered trades and set rules for overtime and child labor. The floor was lowered first, yet it moved the talk from charity to justice. A clerk could point to a number rather than beg a boss for a raise. A father could refuse an all-night shift without the fear that his child would be hired in his place. Inspectors learned to walk shop floors with notebooks and quiet determination. All these changes met the stubborn facts of the time. Employers still faced thin orders and scarce credit. A union card did not conjure sales. Relief checks could not replace full wages. The point was to tilt the field so that recovery, when it came, would carry more people with it. Great Depression had taught how fast the ground could give way. The new rules were an attempt to fasten planks across the soft places. Families lived the change in small ways that felt large. A widow in Omaha learned to fill out a claim for a monthly check that let her stay in her flat. A young man in Biloxi joined a road crew and sent money to his parents who had taken in cousins. An auto worker in Detroit voted for a steward and then asked for time to attend a meeting. A teacher in Spokane saw a list of children approved for milk and kept the room warmer. Critics counted costs and warned about dependency. Supporters pointed to bridges, clinics, and pay envelopes and said the cost of drift was higher. Courts struck down some parts of the program and forced rewrites that tested patience. Congress amended language and tried again. Agencies shifted staff from one desk to another and kept filing cabinets moving on small wheels. The second wave of the New Deal was a long negotiation with law and with habit. It settled into place through persistence more than bravado. By 1938, the system had clearer lines and a better sense of its reach. Monthly checks began to flow to elders who had waited with patience. Unemployment funds worked unevenly when a sharp relapse hit, and that unevenness revealed gaps that reformers marked for later. Wages at the bottom rose a little as the new floor spread, and hours shortened toward a sane week in more shops. Great Depression still shadowed pay and prices, yet people could point to rules that did not change with the weather. In towns that had once relied on basements and handouts, the map of help now ran through offices with caseworkers and numbers. People learned to keep papers and to appeal decisions. County boards met with staff and argued about shares. The process was uneven, yet fairer. The lessons would travel across fields and roads. During the Great Depression, the plains baked beneath years of drought and wind. Fields that had been broken for wheat turned bare and light. Each gust lifted soil and carried it toward fences and ditches. By noon, a sky that began clear could wear a brown veil. By night, a house might sit under drifts where snow never fell. The rush to plant had deep roots in the war years and the price spikes that followed. Tractors, one-way plows, and new credit pulled the sod open across wide counties. When rain held, harvests looked like proof of a safer future. When rain failed, the thin skin of soil took to the air. Fences filled first, then ditches, then rails, then towns. By 1934, dust storms crossed state lines and turned noon into dusk. Cattle coughed mud and ponds shrank to rings of cracked clay. A farmer tied a rope from house to barn to keep from losing the path during a blow. Children wore wet cloths over faces and waited for the grit to settle. On a Sunday in April 1935, a rolling wall rose in the panhandles and buried the day. People called it Black Sunday, though no night ever felt like that noon. Doctors saw throats lined with dust and called it pneumonia of the plains. Mothers beat blankets on clotheslines and found more grit within minutes. Water stood in milk pans to settle silt before a child could drink. Some families stuffed windows with newspaper and pasted seams with flour paste. A broom sat by every door, and sweeping turned into daily prayer. The Great Depression magnified each gust because prices had fallen and debt had not. Federal policy reached out with two linked ideas: to lift prices and to hold the soil. Payments for smaller plantings promised relief, while a new service taught terraces, contour rows, and grass strips. Crews drove pegs along hills and showed how water could be slowed and guided. Windbreaks of young trees rose in lines across bare sections and waited for years to grow. The Resettlement Administration looked for the worst places and offered loans and new starts. Later, the Farm Security Administration helped small operators with credit, seed, and advice. Field agents drove long loops on rough roads and took notes in little books. They kept lists of wells gone dry, barns without roofs, and families close to leaving. They tried to match loans and skill so that help would last. Photographers working for the agency recorded the evidence with patience and respect. They stood in fields, on porches, and by tents, and let people look straight into the lens. The pictures traveled through magazines and post offices and added weight to dry words. They helped town voters see what wind had done to neighbors they might never meet. As farms failed, families loaded beds and barrels and took to the road. The word Okie began as a slur and then became a plain label for many who moved. Some headed to California along routes that followed new federal highways. Others stopped in beet fields, onion rows, or oil towns and tried to make rent mile by mile. Cars broke and were mended with wire and tin cut from signs. Babies rode in drawers set on seat frames, and water was carried in jars wrapped with wet burlap. Roadside camps grew near ditches and under cottonwoods where a spigot or stream could be found. Men hunted day work while women cooked beans and kept clothes clean in tubs. Children collected twigs, watched babies, and learned to read still by kerosene light. Sheriffs cleared some camps and pushed people along with warnings or tickets. Growers hired through labor agents who gathered crews and set wages at the gate. At harvest, the price of work often fell when too many hungry hands arrived. The Farm Security Administration built camps with wells, showers, laundry tables, and meeting sheds. Residents elected councils and wrote rules that barred drinking and fought pest control and theft. A nurse kept hours, a teacher ran classes, and a guard made rounds at night. These places offered dignity and clean water, while families searched for steady work. They did not promise jobs or high pay, yet they turned fear into order for a time. Towns in the valleys wavered between welcome and warning. Civic leaders wrote of public burden and called meetings to guard relief lists. Some sheriffs set roadblocks and turned back cars that held families with little cash. Other towns opened surplus kitchens and asked churches to host clinics and cribs. Citizens argued in letters to editors about duty, wages, and the shape of their streets. The pay for field work moved with crops, weather, and machines that changed the count of hands. Tractors spread through orchards and rows, and harvesters began to appear in cotton toward the decade's end. Growers looked at thin margins and bought steel when they could, then hired fewer pickers. Families who had followed the season now weighed new routes or new trades. The Great Depression turned farm labor into a moving puzzle that never quite held still. Inside camps and crowded flats, culture traveled in songs, recipes, and church rules that fit small rooms. Saturday nights brought fiddles, guitars, and feet on planks laid over dirt. Sunday mornings brought quiet lines for coffee, biscuits, and talk about next week's fields. Mothers swapped tips on canning and on saving soap and thread. Fathers passed news on work and watched children sleep in rows of quilts. County nurses visited with scales, eye drops, and clean needles, and they kept cards by family name. Teachers held classes in tents or sheds and asked children to bring orange crates for desks. Some districts charged fees that migrant families could not spare, which kept boys and girls in fields. Advocates pushed for free books and lunches so that parents might send them anyway. Slow gains came where clergy, doctors, and farmers agreed that a literate child was a common good. On the land that people still worked, soil crews marked contours and seeded grass on played-out flats. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted shelter belts across the plains to slow the wind and hold snow. Farmers signed up for terraces and learned to leave trash at the surface so roots could catch moisture. County meetings turned into short schools where neighbors compared notes on drills and results. The measures looked small in any one field, but held power in number across a region. Late in the decade, rains returned in better measure, and grass took root again. Winds still blew, yet the earth rose less often to meet them. War orders soon lifted prices and drew men and women into plants far from the prairie. Families who had settled in the valleys or on coasts faced a choice between fields and factories. Some went home to half-mended farms and trusted the new methods to hold. Stories from the camps and from hard fields kept a hold on American memory. A few books and songs gave names to pain and to stubborn hope. Pictures from the farm agency showed faces that did not ask for pity, only for work and fair terms. Years later, children grew into elders who could still name the taste of dust. They used spare words and called it the Depression, and then fell quiet for a while. Policy left a set of marks that outlived the worst years. Local conservation districts gave farmers a voice in methods and kept attention on soil year by year. Loans and extension agents linked science to barns, wells, and kitchen tables. Rural electric lines stretched across miles that had been dark and made pumps and lights possible for modest sums. Crop insurance began in trials and gave a thin cushion against a bad season for those who joined. The Great Depression and the Dust Bowl weighed heaviest on people with the least power. Black sharecroppers faced eviction when checks for acreage cuts went to landlords. Some counties tried to share the money, while others kept it behind tall counters. Mexican and Mexican-American pickers met raids and papers they could not read, and many left under pressure. Native nations saw cattle herds cut and grazing rules imposed by distant plans that rarely matched local need. Across the decade, families learned a new ethic of land and water that did not fade when the sky cleared. Neighbors borrowed drills and seed, kept notes on terraces, and called the county office for help without shame. Women set up canning days, saved jars, and traded recipes that made beans feel like choice rather than defeat. Men carried cards that showed last year's yields and loans, and learned to read soil maps as if they were weather charts. Children who had ridden west grew into adults who could switch between fieldwork and shop work with quiet skill. Some found unions in mills and canneries and carried the memory of seasoned crews into new votes. Some returned to counties on the plains and served on soil district boards and school boards and church building committees. The Great Depression had forced hard moves, yet it also wrote habits of cooperation and record keeping that shaped later growth. People who once distrusted offices now expected fair forms, clear lines, and open ledgers. That change would matter when storms of law and coalitions rose around the programs that kept them fed and working. By the late 30s, the Great Depression still pressed on towns and farms, yet the worst dust had eased. Policies born in grit faced courtroom tests and loud opposition from chambers of commerce and from some newspapers. Farm groups, camp councils, and new unions answered with meetings, letters, and votes that turned hardship into a force. The next chapter of this story formed in courts, campaigns, and crowded halls across states. During the Great Depression, the shape of power shifted in courtrooms, on airwaves, and inside party halls. Programs that had begun as emergency tools now faced judges, critics, and allies with their own claims. The government tested where its reach ended, and the public learned who would stand with it in hard votes. Out of those trials came a coalition that reshaped elections and a line of cases that rewrote the map of federal work. Early in 1935, the Supreme Court struck down the heart of the Industrial Recovery Plan, built on voluntary codes and blue emblems. The plan had asked each trade to set fair hours and wages and to police ruinous price cutting. Owners joined the meetings and signed papers, then posted window signs with a small eagle to show support. In the case that became famous as the sick chicken suit, the justices said the law reached too far into local business. The decision erased the codes and left factories and shops to wonder what rules still stood. Months later, the farm program met the same fate when the court held that its tax and payments strayed beyond granted powers. The plan had paid growers to leave fields idle so that prices could rise from crushing lows. County agents had measured acres with ropes and pegs and had written checks that kept barns from auction. When the ruling arrived, officials moved quickly to rebuild the effort under soil work and conservation, which fit a different path. The pivot showed how a single vote could force policy to search for new ground. Another case trimmed a coal law that tried to set wages and hours in a vital industry. The pattern bred confusion on shop floors and at courthouse desks. Local boards stopped meetings while lawyers searched for guidance. Workers who had hoped for stable rules faced a pause that felt like a return to the worst months of drift. Editors ran charts that counted losses and wrote that good intent did not answer a test set by the Constitution. As these defeats landed, the White House reached outward and gathered a broad alliance that would carry elections through the decade. City machines delivered blocks of votes from wards filled with recent immigrants who saw work crews and relief officers as signs that government could notice their lives. Southern Democrats held committees, brought in farm money, and watched for any threat to local customs that they guarded with stubborn care. Black voters in northern cities weighed a shift that had been building since the last election and moved toward the party that now offered jobs and a listening ear. Industrial workers joined through unions and through new political groups that taught members how to register, recruit, and vote. Women organized clubs, staffed precinct tables, and pushed for rules that protected families in lean months. The election of 1936 tested whether Great Depression alliance could withstand attacks from both right and left. Business leaders and a new Liberty League said the program throttled investment and dulled enterprise. Radio priests and populists said the sums were small and the vision too narrow for people in lines. A doctor with a plan for old age checks drew crowds who cheered simple arithmetic that did not balance in ledgers, yet felt merciful to ears that had heard no before. A senator from Louisiana promised to share wealth and to cut fortunes down to size, and his words ran ahead of him until bullets stopped them. Voters listened to all of this and then chose in vast numbers to keep the course they knew. The margin gave the administration a sense that the country had endorsed its aims, though not every method. In neighborhoods, the coalition looked like a block captain who spoke 2 languages and a precinct room that smelled of coffee and floor wax. It looked like a union hall with a Sunday school in one corner and a baby clinic in the other. It looked like a county agent walking fields with a notebook while a minister read meeting notes to elders who wanted clean accounts. It looked like a woman who had never voted before taking her place at a long table and checking names with neat care. In early 1937, a new fight opened when the president asked Congress to add justices to the High Court. He said age had slowed work and that fresh hands would speed decisions. Many heard a bid to change outcomes and to tame a bench that had ruined key laws. Senators from his own party recoiled, and judges warned about the cost to faith in a fair third branch. Newspapermen drew cartoons of a giant hand reaching for the scales, and the image stuck. Hearing stretched for weeks and filled columns with careful quotes that hid raw nerves. The bill stalled and then faded as votes lined up against it. While the plan faltered, the court began to uphold measures that earlier majorities had doubted. A case from Washington state accepted a minimum wage for women and said liberty could include protection against harsh bargains. Another case confirmed the labor law that gave workers a right to organize and to seek contracts with their employers. 2 more decisions approved the core of social insurance and the tax that funded it. Lawyers spoke softly of a switch in tone that made space for national answers to local pain. Historians would argue later about motives, yet the effect was clear in pay envelopes and on relief rolls. Even as laws survived, the economy staggered again in 1937 when spending was cut and credit tightened. Factories slowed, markets dipped, and relief lines grew longer through the winter. That relapse would open a new policy fight about budgets and demand that tested faith within the coalition. For the moment, the legal ground had steadied, and the question was how to use it well. Inside the alliance, tensions ran along old lines that the crisis had not erased. Southern leaders guarded segregation and blocked bills that would have punished mob murder, even while they backed farm checks and roads. Black voters in northern wards formed clubs, wrote letters, and asked for jobs in agencies that served their streets. Labor organizers pushed organizers in textile towns and met sheriffs who enforced old ways with force and with friendly judges. Farm advocates wanted parity for crops, while shop workers wanted steady hours and pay, and both looked to Washington for help. The alliance held because its center promised enough to each part to justify patience. Radio helped bind the parts with talks that explained choices in plain words and with a tone that respected listeners. Newspapers remained divided, yet even hostile pages printed the schedules and rules that mattered for farms and jobs. Pollsters began to ask careful questions, and parties learned to count feelings before votes were cast. Unions formed political arms that registered new citizens, held picnics, and taught people how to mark a ballot. Churches, fraternal halls, and lodges ran meetings that paired music with speakers who made government feel less distant. Many businesses adjusted to the new frame and learned to live with inspectors, forms, and complaint desks. Accounting firms offered services that kept books ready for audits, and banks built compliance teams that spoke a new language. Insurers wrote policies that matched safety codes, and makers of machines added guards and labels that cut injuries. Some owners still cursed, yet most found that stability could be worth the price of rules. They also saw that customers with pay and pensions bought more than customers with fear. The loudest critics on the right regrouped after the landslide and tried to halt what they called creeping control. Courts slowed some rules, committees aired charges, and a few governors built campaigns that promised to cut spending to the bone. The Liberty League lost steam as its donors tired of defeat, though its ideas lived on in clubs and editorials. Business groups learned to argue in details rather than in absolutes, and they won narrow changes that mattered to plants and payrolls. On the left, the radio priest turned on the White House and then lost stations as his talk grew harsh and strange. Towns and clubs kept mailing petitions and shaped debate even as the new insurance system took form on quieter terms. Farm protest groups demanded parity and credit, and they counted victories when checks arrived and rates fell. Socialists and small parties held meetings that felt earnest and thin, and they sent a trickle of members into unions and city boards. In 1938, a sharp midterm handed new seats to opponents and gave birth to a working partnership between Republicans and Southern Democrats. They could block bills they disliked and slow others, and they used that power often. Still, the wage and hour law passed that year and set a federal floor under pay and a standard week in covered trades. The path to that vote showed that even with a split Congress, parts of the program could move when pressure was steady and public support plain. Out of the fights The Great Depression produced a political map that lasted into the middle of the century. Urban workers, farmers, black migrants in northern wards, and many women learned to act together when bread and rent were at stake. Business found that clear rules could be lived with, and courts found that national problems could permit national cures. New habits of voting and of reading the news grew from radios and leaflets and from neighbors who could now see the next month as more than a guess. The coalition had cracks that would widen later, yet in these years it kept lights on and gave work to people who once had only lines. Through Great Depression years, these lessons settled, ready to guide the choices that followed. Great Depression framed the downturn of 1937 and 1938 as another hard bend in a long road of strain and adaptation. Factories had begun to hum again, and shops felt steadier, yet the base under those gains was thin. Budgets tightened at the federal level, project roles shrank, and new payroll taxes started up just as buyers hesitated. At the central bank, reserve rules were raised, and gold flows were held aside from credit, and the effect reached factory floors and rail yards. By autumn, production fell in steps that felt cruel, because they came after 2 years of slow rebuilding. Inventories had been rebuilt during the upswing, and then orders cooled when shops judged shelves were full enough. Companies cut overtime first, and then hours, and soon whole lines paused. Relief offices saw the change in quiet ways, like more men at the door before the rain, and more women asking about coal. News pages spoke of a check in business that might pass in a season, but mills heard the tone of a deeper sag. In the spring of 1937, the first regular taxes for old age insurance began to be collected from wages and from employers. At the same time, relief budgets were trimmed, and work crews on federal projects were reduced. These steps were taken with a hope that private demand would carry more of the load. In many towns, the timing worked against fragile gains. Manufacturers had rebuilt their stocks in 1936 and early 1937, then slowed fresh orders once shelves seemed high. Retailers passed caution upstream, and mills read the signal as a reason to idle machines. Railroads noticed lighter cars and fewer trains, and those notices gathered into dispatches that sounded like warning bells. Small banks again faced depositors with tired faces and small envelopes. The central bank had raised required reserves in steps during 1936 and 1937 to guard against a flood of idle balances. It also kept gold inflows from widening credit by holding new metal away from open market support. These measures looked tidy on paper, and they seemed prudent after years of emergency. On the shop floor, they tightened money at the same moment that orders softened. Labor relations also shifted the rhythm inside big plants by 1937. Sit-down strikes won contracts in autos and rubber, and then managers adjusted job rules and schedules to fit new agreements. Output paused while shifts were rewritten and grievances tested. Those pauses met the softening in orders and made the slide feel sharper. Public debate split into two clear schools that winter. One said the budget should be balanced even in trial, and that confidence would return on proof of thrift. The other said the government must spend when buyers could not, and that only new demand would stop the fall. Newspapers ran careful editorials for each case, and families argued across tables with rent due. Inside the Treasury, leaders who prized surpluses had long held the upper hand. They believed that recovery needed clean books, and they feared that heavy borrowing would choke credit for private work. Others inside the administration pointed to empty order books and idle crews and asked for bolder appropriations. The argument was joined in speeches, in letters, and in memos that read like appeals from different worlds. As months passed, industrial output slipped by wide margins, and unemployment rose again where it had fallen. WPA crews were cut and then rehired, and the stop-and-start rhythm frayed nerves in many houses. In kitchens, people clipped coupons and pawned small things, then bought them back when a few days of pay returned. Radio preachers blamed sin or monopoly, and experts on panels blamed policy or error. Great Depression still shaped every choice, because the memory of collapse made leaders wary of every step. Officials did not want inflation to run, and they did not want banks to grow reckless. They feared a return to ruin if rules were loosed too far. That caution, helpful in crisis, now pushed against gains that had only begun to breathe. In the late winter, the administration shifted course and asked Congress for a large program of spending on relief and on public works. Budget officers who had warned against deficits now accepted them as a price for stability. Appropriations were rushed through committees that had learned how to count crews and sites. Orders for steel, cement, and lumber rose, and payrolls fattened by small amounts that helped at once. Unemployment remained high even after the turn, and the blow of the relapse marked families who had just begun to hope. Children who had moved from soup lines to school lunches now feared a gap again. Fathers forgot the feel of steady work and remembered how to make coal last with paper bricks. Mothers hid bills under cloth and walked to markets at dawn to find cheap greens. Teachers, relief workers, and nurses felt the swing before charts did. Classrooms filled again by noon because job hunts had ended early. Clinics saw more women in thin coats and more children with coughs. Caseworkers learned to explain cutbacks and then to explain new funds, and the strange showed in their faces. In business circles, the relapse reopened fights over monopoly and over the structure of markets. Some argued that combinations had held prices too high and smothered small firms. Others argued that scale saved costs and that recovery would be faster if government stopped filing suits. A national committee was formed to study concentration, and hearings drew headlines that mixed law with theatre. Great Depression also shaped politics in 1938, as elections approached after the court fight and the slump. Relations inside the ruling party had frayed, and some leaders sought to dislodge conservative allies who blocked bills. Voters returned a mixed verdict, and opponents gained strength enough to restrain new measures. Even so, the wage and hour law passed and gave a national floor under pay and a shorter week where it reached. By late 1938, production began to lift again as relief funds flowed and as private orders returned slowly. New aircraft plans and foreign contracts added small streams of work that would soon grow. Families eased a little, then saved a little, and then dared a few purchases they had delayed since spring. The turn was not dramatic, and it felt fragile, yet it spread month by month. In homes, people discussed what the relapse had taught. They said that budgets mattered, and they also said that timing mattered as much. They said that public work could steady private work if it arrived before fear hardened. They said that money could be safe in banks if the sight of trouble did not cause every hand to grab at once. Policymakers kept their own lists in ledgers and in memory. They noted that the withdrawal of support had been too quick. They noted that tighter reserves had multiplied through banks at a time when trust was still new. They noted that a floor under wages needed a floor under demand to support it. Great Depression thinking widened after the relapse as more officials accepted that deficits could be tools in a storm. Some had read the new theories and used their words. Others came by experience because they had watched crews go home when projects paused and had watched stores pick up when crews returned. Either path led to the same view, which was that timing and size could decide whether a program worked. The relapse also changed business opinion in places where managers had once favored strict cuts. They saw that orders from public jobs reached their plants and that steady checks turned into steady sales. They did not adopt new theories, yet they told senators to keep crews at work while private demand healed. They warned against sharp policy turns that would throw off the balance they were trying to hold. On farms, the relapse meant fewer orders for tools and seed, and it tested soil programs that had promised steadier incomes. County meetings stayed full, and farmers kept the new rows and terraces because they believed the methods worked. Checks arrived late in some places where paperwork piled high, and that delay stirred anger without breaking trust. Families still measured hope by rain, by prices, and by mail that brought help through hard months. Great Depression language settled into classrooms and news articles during these years as teachers tried to explain cycles. Students plotted lines of output and prices and learned how inventories could amplify a change. They heard that policy could lean with the wind instead of against it during a storm. They also heard that trust, once lost, took time to rebuild and could not be bought in a single vote. In churches and union halls, the story of 1937 and 1938 was told in plainer words. People said the government had let go too soon and then grabbed again when the fall grew steep. They said banks had been told to hold back just when trade needed air. They said the lesson was caution with courage, not caution alone. By 1939, the economy had regained much of the loss from the relapse, and new orders arrived from abroad for planes and engines. Crews trained for precision work, and yards echoed with new sounds that hinted at a larger task ahead. Families still counted coins, yet the fear that had spread in 1938 began to break. Great Depression lessons were not forgotten as the nation faced a world that was heating toward war. Factories would soon turn from patchy orders to round-the-clock schedules, and dry docks would fill with hulls that pulled thousands back into steady pay. The policy fight of 1937 and 1938 left a ledger of cautions and a set of tools, and those tools would guide choices as mobilization gathered speed. Great Depression still hung over daily life in 1940, yet new winds rose as the country prepared for defense and then for war. Factories that had idled restarted with contracts for aircraft, trucks, and machine tools. The draft returned and turned young men into trainees at camps that grew like small cities. Shipyards lit the coasts at night. The phrase arsenal of democracy moved from a radio line into orders, pay, and long shifts. Housewives pinned ration books to kitchen boards. Saving stamps filled into bond books one square at a time. The mood shifted from waiting to doing, and work returned. Conversion began with hard choices and patient planning. Auto lines stopped and retooled for tanks, engines, and guns that fired shells far from home. New suppliers learned to forge parts with precise tolerances and to ship on schedules that left no slack. Managers met with union committees to set job rules that matched speed with safety. The War Production Board set priorities, assigned materials, and cleared bottlenecks across regions. Steel, rubber, copper, and aluminum moved by carload and by barge to plants that learned new rhythms. Each week brought charts, targets, and night shifts that ended at dawn. Employment surged and the long lines shrank until full schedules replaced relief in most towns. Women entered shops and yards in numbers large enough to change every break room and every bus route. Posters showed a woman with a scarf and a strong arm, yet the deeper story was practice and skill. Inspectors taught how to read gauges, how to drill clean holes, and how to keep fixtures square. Pay often lagged behind men's rates, and some managers doubted at first, then changed their view when output rose. Daycare centers opened near plants, and schools let out to harvest victory gardens. Black workers joined the defense boom through migration from farms and small towns into cities that held new promise and old barriers. The Double V campaign asked for victory abroad and at home. Leaders pressed for fair access to jobs and training. A federal committee on fair employment heard complaints and pushed contractors to open doors. Some plants resisted, others hired and promoted and found the results plain in output. Neighborhoods changed as families arrived from the Delta and from piney woods, and churches raised funds for housing and schools. Music and food traveled with them and reshaped city blocks. Fear after the attack brought a grave wrong to the West Coast. Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were ordered from their homes and sent to remote camps behind wire. Families sold shops and farms for a fraction of their worth and packed what they could carry. Barracks rose on sagebrush flats and in deserts swept by dust. Schools opened in mess halls, and work crews built ditches and gardens. Young men volunteered for units that fought with rare distinction abroad. The loss at home lasted longer than the war and left scars that families would teach in quiet rooms. Rationing shaped kitchens and shops. The Office of Price Administration fixed ceilings on staples and issued stamps for sugar, meat, gasoline, and shoes. People learned to save points and plan meals with careful lists. Tires were precious, because rubber was tight and gas coupons kept miles low. Scrap drives gathered pots, rags, and paper, and children pushed wagons that clattered with cans. War bonds sold at windows in post offices, banks, and factories. Posters asked for 10% every payday, and payroll clerks filled out forms with blunt pencils. Frugality turned into common pride rather than private shame. Taxes rose and reached more households than ever before. Withholding began so that pay envelopes carried smaller sums and steadier accounts. The National War Labor Board weighed disputes and sought to keep factories running. Wage rules tried to hold a line while prices stayed under ceilings. Cost of living adjustments appeared and then were revised. Some strikes broke out when men felt the rules were unfair. Most ended with quick settlements because war orders had to move. Families counted coupons and dollars and judged that fairness meant enough heat, food, and rent to keep a home steady. Training and science moved in step with production. Universities ran accelerated courses in engineering, chemistry, and navigation. New labs tested alloys, plastics, and lubricants that could survive heat and pressure. Radar spread from diagrams to sets that watched skies and seas in storms. Penicillin left lab benches for hospitals and saved men who would have died of wounds and fevers. Women served as mathematicians, map makers, and translators, and many stayed in those fields after the final victory. Administration learned to guide large projects and to keep secrets, and those habits would carry into peace. Mobilization rearranged the map. Workers moved to coastal shipyards and to inland aircraft plants. The West and parts of the South filled with newcomers, and the first outlines of a later Sun Belt appeared. Housing lagged behind jobs, so trailers lined fields and schoolyards, and federal projects rose fast, with simple walls and thin roofs. Some neighborhoods barred newcomers by race, and others drew lines by custom rather than law. A guest worker program brought farm labor from Mexico to harvest crops, and families learned to live across borders that changed with seasons. Military service pulled millions from the labor force, and factories backfilled with older men, women, and youths who learned fast. Families measured time by letters and by furloughs. V-mail folded lives into thin sheets that carried news across oceans. The USO staged shows in base theaters and in tents beside muddy roads. The Red Cross trained nurses and gathered blood and bandages. Morale teams wrote guides for leaders on how to keep units steady. At home, neighbors mowed lawns for wives with small children and kept cars running with borrowed tools. Output reached levels that had once seemed impossible. Shipyards launched cargo vessels at a pace that stunned old hands, and welding replaced riveting to save time. Assembly plants rolled bombers from lines that never slept, and one field gained a mile of roof to cover work from weather. Machine shops learned to grind to thousandths as a matter of habit. Training films showed how to avoid accidents when speed called for care. The pride of crews grew with each completed hull, engine, or truck, and workers signed their names inside places that few would ever see. Regions felt the surge in distinct ways. The South saw new plants, bases, and training fields that pulled money into towns that had known long scarcity. Electric lines reached more farms, and roads improved to carry convoys. Along the coasts, civil defense drills taught families to darken windows, and wardens walked night blocks with whistles and flashlights. Plane spotters climbed towers and logged silhouettes against cloud and moon. Inland cities practiced alarms and cleared stairwells to basements. The work could feel weary, yet it bound neighbors who had rarely spoken before the year of mobilization. With jobs plentiful, families built small cushions for the first time in years. Savings bonds filled drawers, and bank accounts grew. Kitchens gained new stoves, and roofs were patched at last. A no-strike pledge held in most industries, though tempers flared in a few walks and mines. Coal stoppages brought sharp words on the radio and quick trips by mediators. Childcare remained thin, and older sisters took charge in long afternoons. Many couples postponed weddings or had quick ceremonies before a train north. Hope took a quieter shape, which was the picture of a life after the guns. The budget swelled with wartime bills, and debt rose to heights never seen before. Yet paychecks arrived on time, and overtime made weeks feel thick with hours. Bond drives featured actors, ball players, and workers who spoke plainly about why they saved. Inflation pressure stood at the door, and controls kept it from rushing in. Some goods disappeared and returned months later with new labels and lighter packages. People adapted and grew used to planning, and the habit of thrift learned in the slump now served the effort in a different way. By 1944 and 1945, the shape of victory was visible, and planning for peace moved beside production. Demobilization centers built schedules for trains and ships. Reconversion plans told automakers when to tool again for civilian models, and told textile mills when to change runs. A bill for veterans promised tuition, stipends, and loans for homes and farms. Counselors visited plants to explain forms and deadlines. Women weighed whether to stay in new trades or to return to older roles, and many chose a mix of work and home. Expectations had changed, and families knew it. As the guns fell silent, the old fear returned in a new form. People asked whether jobs would vanish again when contracts ended. Leaders remembered the bitter winters and vowed to avoid a return to lines. Savings and pent-up demand formed a reservoir for stores and builders. Plans for housing gathered speed, and veterans dreamed of lawns, schools, and small businesses. Highways and airports drawn for war hinted at a network for peace. The long downturn had taught caution. The new season asked for confidence that did not forget. Work did not end on the day of surrender. Plants ran through backlogs while teams counted tools and parts for civilian lines. Procurement officers closed thousands of contracts and arranged sales of surplus that would feed garages and shops for years. Unions prepared to renegotiate wartime clauses, and managers drafted new schedules without night shifts. Veterans registered at employment offices that now offered tests and counselors. Colleges prepared for crowded lecture halls. City planners studied maps marked with wartime plants and imagined peacetime districts around them. The Great Depression had taught households to stretch and to plan, and that habit guided choices in the first weeks of peace. The Great Depression had also fixed a fear of sudden loss, which made savings and insurance feel like anchors rather than luxuries. The Great Depression did not return because work and demand stayed strong, yet the memory remained close. Quietly, people exhaled and looked toward ordinary days with careful hope. Great Depression left behind laws, habits, and memories that shaped American life long after the last relief line. Out of bank runs came deposit insurance and supervision that prized clean books and steady nerves. Out of the collapse of trust came the idea that clear rules could guard markets without smothering trade. Ordinary people learned that government could act at scale when fear tightened every choice. They also learned to expect plain talk when balances were thin. Those lessons settled into daily life like furniture that never left the room. The heart of what changed was security. Social security took shape in ledgers and in mailboxes and became a quiet promise that age would not mean hunger by default. Unemployment insurance spread across states and turned layoffs into a season that had an end, not a fall with no flaw. Relief programs taught methods that later agencies kept, such as casework, hot lunches, and public clinics. Great Depression turned the old charity map into a civic system that treated help as a right when the economy failed the household. Workplaces changed as well. The right to organize was written into law and backed by a board that heard claims and ran fair elections. Minimum wages and shorter weeks set a floor under the most fragile jobs. Complaints found inspectors with real authority. Unions learned procedure and built welfare funds. Halls and stewards who settled small fights before they grew. Great Depression taught that order in a plant was not only muscle, and the slump made rules feel like survival rather than theory. Markets did not return to the freewheeling style of the 20s. Disclosure became standard for new offerings, and brokers faced duties that kept small savers from traps they could not see. Deposit insurance calmed mourning rumors, and bank failures faded into rare stories. Central bankers learned to watch jobs and prices, not gold alone. Budget makers learned that sharp cuts in a weak year could break the climb. Great Depression pulled caution into finance without shutting the door on invention. The map of the country shifted because of dams, roads, airfields, and lines that carried power to farms and towns. River valleys gained lights and factories where nights had been dark. Rural homes plugged in pumps, irons, and radios, and felt the hour stretch with the flip of a switch. Highways stitched regions into new markets and gave families more choice about where to live and work. Great Depression work crews left schools, courthouses, parks, and bridges that still serve. Memory changed as well. People kept the feel of thin winters in the back of their minds, even during later booms. They saved more in jars and in accounts, bought insurance they once thought they could skip, and kept ledgers with quiet care, photographs of Breadlines, Hoovervilles, and storms of dust entered schoolbooks. Great Depression stories traveled through families and set limits on bragging. Speculation lost its shine for a while, and banks were judged by steadiness more than by size. Not everything that endured deserved praise. Early safety net rules excluded domestic and farm workers and cut many black families from core insurance. Relief and jobs often flowed through local offices that followed local custom. Repatriations pushed Mexican families out despite birthright claims. Segregation kept black veterans from fair mortgages and training in many places. Japanese American families lost land and shops and returned to towns that remembered them with mixed tempers. Great Depression reforms held, yet justice moved in halting steps. Politics realigned around new expectations. Voters learned that Washington could matter far beyond elections when storms hit. City machines, farmers, unions, black migrants in northern wards, and many women formed a coalition that held for a long season. Courts adjusted to wider federal roles while preserving limits that would still bite. Pollsters mapped attitudes, and radio talks made policy feel close. Agencies kept files, standards, and trained people who could move when called. Great Depression made the modern presidency larger in duty and in reach, and citizens grew used to that scale. Health and learning also carried marks that lasted. Public clinics grew from relief work and stayed to give vaccines, milk, and prenatal care. School lunches, born of farm surpluses, became a shield for children in thin years. Universities and labs that had trained workers for dams and plants kept that capacity for peacetime science. A broader view of mental stress entered care after long seasons of job loss and worry. Great Depression experience made the case that prevention was cheaper than rescue, and that local nurses could save futures on small budgets. The land itself bore signs of change. Conservation districts spread across counties and gave farmers a way to share methods and hold each other to good practice. Terraces, cover crops, and windbreaks became ordinary work. Crop insurance began in trials and matured into a tool that softened bad years. Flood control projects and careful mapping of watersheds reduced the shock of storms. Great Depression, hunger for roots and stability, met a practical ethic of stewardship. People learned to treat soil, water, and timber as savings that could earn interest if tended with patience. Debate did not end. Citizens argued about the size of government, the reach of rules, and the risks of debt. Some warned that safety nets dull effort. Others said security frees people to try. Central bankers guarded their room to act and learned to speak carefully to keep faith. Regulators balanced fraud control with space for new ideas. Mayors measured pride by how fast crews could work after a flood or a fire. Great Depression left tools on the bench and arguments on the table, and both remained part of ordinary civic life. Households carried the mark in choices that seemed small. Couples kept emergency funds and bought modest houses with fixed loans. Parents told children to learn a trade and a skill with numbers. Kitchens kept gardens, canners, and recipes that stretched taste and money. Church groups, lodges, and unions kept mutual aid lists for illness and funerals. Co-ops for credit, milk, and fuel grew in towns that had once trusted only a banker and a dealer. Great Depression, thrift, and cooperation turned into habits that could be passed along at a table without speeches. In memory, the era stands as both warning and guide. Great Depression shows what happens when fragile systems meet shock, and it shows how patient work can rebuild faith. The nation learned to plan, to count plainly, and to act when waiting would invite ruin. It learned that markets need light and that families need flaws. It learned that fairness is not automatic and that voices left out will return for a hearing. What changed were the tools and the reach of common care. What endured was the desire to keep one another afloat when the water rises high again.